this is amazing. You know, you're sitting here with two writers, and we never quite know what the audience is going to be. You know, sometimes it's one of you, sometimes it's none of you. And bookstores are always apologetic before the event even begins. They say things like, you know, we made a flyer and we hung it in the employee restroom, but we don't know what we're going to get tonight, and there's a PTA meeting, and you know how that goes.
And you said it might rain.
Yeah, it's supposed to rain tomorrow, So good evening, everyone. My name is Wiley. I'm the alumni author in residence here at UNC Asheville, and I want to thank you all for joining us for the final event for the Spring 2022 Common Word Community Read. Our selection for the semester has been The Last Castle by Denise Kiernan, who is with us this evening. And so far this semester we have heard a lecture by Dr. Dan Pierce from the History Department about what George Vanderbilt found when he first arrived in Asheville in the decade before the turn of the century. We also watched the documentary America's First Forest and learned about the Forestry program that accompanied George Vanderbilt's vision for the area. And tonight we'll hear from author Denise Kiernan about her research and her interest that drew her to tell the story of America's Last Castle. The Common Word Community Read was designed to unite the campus and the local community around a single text, and it could not have happened or been as successful as it has been without the initial idea proposed by Vice Chancellor Kirk Swinson, who's here with us this evening, so thank you to Vice Chancellor Swinson, or the unyielding work and service and sweat equity of Colleen O'Neill, who's back in the back of the room still sweating from moving all of these chairs. I helped her a little bit. I also want to thank Kevin Fuller for keeping us live and streaming throughout the academic year. And I want to thank Catherine Frank and the folks here at the Reuters Center for opening the doors to this beautiful space to us. Part of what makes Asheville in this region so wonderful is its history, which we learned about reading Denise's book. And if you haven't yet read it, there are copies for sale outside. So I think that after this evening, you'll want to pick up one of those from Malaprops. But what also makes this place notably important is the role it is playing in our current moment and the role it will continue to play in the future. It is in that spirit that this morning UNC Asheville officially announced the inaugural Asheville Ideas Fest with a press conference, which was very exciting for me to have taken part in. That'll take place on this campus and in this community this summer, from June 14th to 18th. And we'll be hosting national leaders in thought, science, and the humanities, including Fareed Zakaria, historian John Meacham, and Dr. Kismakia Corbett, who developed the Moderna vaccine. I'm particularly excited that we will be hosting North Carolina's 2 National Book Award winners for fiction. Charles Frazier, author of Cold Mountain, which won the National Book Award in 1997, and Jason Mott, author of Hell of a Book, which won the National Book Award earlier this year. Hell of a Book will also serve as our fall selection for the Common Word Community Read. So we invite you all to come here and meet Jason and listen to him as part of this stellar lineup of leaders, scientists, musicians, and writers that will be with us for the inaugural Asheville Ideas Fest. And you can learn more about that at ashevilleideasfest.com. That's June 14th through 18th. You can see a full lineup and register for that wonderful celebration there. So tonight, I am so excited to have Denise here with us. And I'll read her bio and then I'll tell you the true story. Denise Kiernan is an author, journalist, producer, and host of Craft, Authors in Conversation. Her latest book, We Gathered Together, arrived winter 2020, which was a great time to publish a book, let me tell you. Yeah. Her previous 2 titles, The Last Castle and The Girls of Atomic City, were both instant New York Times bestsellers in both hardcover and paperback. The Last Castle was also a Wall Street Journal bestseller, a finalist for the 2018 Thomas Wolfe Memorial Literary Award, and a finalist for the Southern Book Prize. The Girls of Atomic City was also a Los Angeles Times and NPR bestseller, and was named one of Amazon's top 100 best books of 2013, and is now available in multiple languages. It was also awarded the 2014 American Political Science Association's Woodrow Wilson Foundation Award for the best book published in the United States on government, politics, or international affairs.
Which is not as boring as it sounds.
It's pretty lively. She has also co-authored several popular history titles, including Signing Their Lives Away, Signing Their Rights Away, and Stuff Every American Should Know. She's been published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Village Voice, Time, Ms. Magazine, Reader's Digest, Discover, and many more publications. She has also worked in television, serving as head writer for ABC's Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? We'll be using one of our lifelines tonight during its, I'm sure you get so tired of that when people read your bio. Somebody makes that comment every time. And she's produced for media outlets like ESPN and MSNBC. Throughout her career, she's been a featured guest on many radio and television shows, including NPR's Weekend Edition, PBS NewsHour, MSNBC Morning Joe, and The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. She lives in North Carolina, here in Asheville, actually. We can say that because we're in this city. Denise has been a very good friend to the city of Asheville and to this region and to this university, and she has become a very dear friend to me, my wife Mallory, and our daughters. There was a summer not too long ago where we spent almost every day for several weeks at the Grove Park and pool with Denise and her husband Joe. We had two very young children at the time. And then not long after that, we were at my in-laws' much less elegant pool in Wilmington, North Carolina, and my wife said, what do y'all want to do for lunch, to our daughters? And they said, we'll just order a hamburger. And so, they'll come around with the drinks here in a moment. I said, oh, honeys, we're not with Denise and Joe. We're with Mimi and Grandpa. It's bologna sandwiches and bottled water here, kids. I'm sorry, if you're lucky. But it is wonderful to be with you, Denise, so thank you for giving us some part of your evening tonight.
Thank you, I'm so happy to be here.
So, we have spent the semester reading, discussing Last Castle in multiple different ways. What was your initial calling to write this book? Because I think every book has like that moment where something fizzes in your head and you just lock in and you say, this is next. What was that moment for you?
You understand what this is like, because most of us run around and I keep paper lists of book ideas, I keep computer lists of book ideas, Post-it stuff on whiteboards, and every once in a while you go back and, when it's starting to be time to think about what the next project is, and you look at that list of ideas and you're like, some of them just, God, that's the worst idea I've ever heard of in my life. And other ones, for years, they just won't let you go, they won't let you go. And I had been, ever since we moved here, which is almost 17 years ago now, I'd always been kind of fascinated with Biltmore House and the Gilded Age in general. And I had come here as a kid. We were stationed at Fort Jackson down by Columbia. We'd come up here to go once. And when I moved down here with my Jersey husband, Joe.
Jersey Joe.
Jersey Joe. He had no idea what Biltmore House was, and that was one of the things that kept coming up for me. When you live in Asheville, it's such a massive presence here, as it should be, and you forget that there are actually a lot of people in this country, not only who don't know about the house, but don't know about the forestry history, don't know about all the efforts Edith made, all of those sorts of things. So I thought there's got to be a way into this. And then this one summer, I had two separate friends come down to visit. One was my friend Angela, who you are familiar with. She's a professor at Boston College. She's a very smart gal, extremely well-read, and she was familiar with Biltmore House, but I took her, as you do, you take everybody, and she said, why don't I know more about this place? And I said, I don't know, this is really interesting. About a month later, another friend came down, completely different person, voracious reader, big history buff, and he said, I feel like I don't know anything about this place. And I said, okay, that's interesting. And then there was this documentary called The Queen of Versailles. Did anyone see it? I'm seeing a few hands. Okay, it is fascinating. This documentary came out. It was about a real estate developer in Florida who announced he was going to build the biggest house in America. And he announced this very publicly and very repeatedly, and it was going to have gold this and silver plated that and all that sort of stuff. And he allows a film crew to follow him and his family around while they're seeking to construct this. They never finish it, first of all. If it had been finished, it was gonna be like 90,000 square feet. Okay, so literally half the size, like almost half the size of Biltmore. And the press, when they were talking about this documentary, all over just kept saying, this is gonna be the biggest house in America, this is gonna be the biggest house in America. And I'm like, are none of you people even Googling? You know, I mean, come on. And that's when I said, I'm gonna do this.
Yeah.
So was the Queen of Versailles.
Yeah.
So Versailles led me to Biltmore.
Well, we can talk about those French chateaux and their effect on Biltmore, the real effect on Biltmore. So aside from popular culture and Florida people, what kind of research did you find yourself doing? Like, were there some exciting moments, some exciting aha moments when you were in a particular archive, or you met somebody, or you really felt like you were chasing down a new piece of information?
The vast majority of the papers came from the New York Public Library Manuscript and Archives Division, which is a spectacular place, and you get to go in the big beautiful library on Fifth Avenue with the lions. And one of George Vanderbilt's best friends, William Field, has his papers there, and his brother's papers, and his mother's papers, and he wrote constantly. Because one of the interesting things about doing historical research is when you're looking for archives, like say I write you a letter. When we die, my writing, my thoughts are in his archives, not in mine. And things often don't get sent back to whoever the family is or whatever. So you often find yourself finding some of the best information by going to friends and relatives and colleagues of the people you're interested in. And William wrote his mother constantly and was writing about George, and when George met Edith, and when they were planning George's wedding and everything he had to do that day and all the travels. And it was just an incredible amount of detail. And one of the aspects of the book that I liked was a very well-known author at the time, Paul Lester Ford. I won't tell you what happens to him because I think it's one of the more interesting parts of the book. But Ford's papers are at the New York Public Library as well. His name is also etched in the marble in the lobby, as is his brother Worthington. His father was one of the greatest collectors of Americana in the country, still is that collection. And he and George wrote letters back and forth, so those letters were in Ford's papers. And after Ford passed away, Edith stayed very close with his sister, Emily. And this was one of my favorite finds. There was always a lot of talk about, they think, George and Edith were supposed to be on the Titanic, but, they don't know why they canceled, whatever. I found a letter in Emily's papers, nobody else's, where Edith Vanderbilt was writing Emily saying, we just decided, I can't believe, at the 11th hour, we decided not to take the Titanic, and there it was, in Edith's own hand. And so that was pretty exciting. But, it's the different, the forestry research was fascinating to me. Carl Schenk, fascinating.
Yeah. Those moments in the archives are fascinating when you see something that you thought might be out there comes into your hand. It's almost like history's reaching out and touching you. Years ago, I was at the Widener Library at Harvard doing some work on Thomas Wolfe, and I found a sheet of paper where he had drawn a map of Asheville and labeled the streets, and then had renamed them what he named them in Look Homeward Angel.
Oh my God!
Like the Rosetta Stone. And I hadn't found anything that people didn't know existed, but it was just a moment of, oh my God, how amazing.
But there's also something so magical about touching paper that somebody else touched and getting to know, you can start to recognize, you can flip through a folder and you're like, oh, so-and-so wrote that, because you get to know their handwriting. And seeing the canceled postage and all that, and now they're taking people's hard drives.
Yeah.
Which, I'm glad they're taking the hard drives, but, that's not fun.
So, one thing that I loved about the book is how, and you do this with Girls of Atomic City, you nailed down the moment historically, culturally, in which these events are taking place. And the book opens in 1888 with Edith and her sister, right? She had one sisters settling into New York City. And then at roughly the same time, George Vanderbilt is coming to Asheville for what we think is the first time, right? So can you set the moment for us in 1888? What is the national moment? What is the moment in Asheville? What do these things look like? What did this country feel like then?
The Gilded Age was still gilding and doing its thing, but the Industrial Age was definitely starting to have an impact on the class society that existed in America. And that was one of the reasons that I find the turn of the 20th century so interesting, because you did have this incredible disparity between the haves and have-nots, one that has not been equaled until recently. And so you had people throwing the most incredibly just indulgent, over-the-top parties, and then you had people living like, 5 to a room in a tenement on the Lower East Side. Asheville back then, Asheville has actually been a second home destination for a very long time. Folks from Charleston would come up here to get away from the heat. Yeah. And what was interesting is it was also becoming a destination for people who were suffering from ailments like tuberculosis, because the belief at the time was that mountain air would cure you. It was a curative thing to breathe. And so there was a group of physicians, or rather well-known physicians, who set up some very popular practices in and around Asheville, and people would come in from all over, and especially New York, to seek their services. And they would have them sit on breathing porches, which were porches where you sat and you breathed. And that was here, doctor, take my money, and I'll go walk and breathe that air over there now, not the porch air. And so it was very, and actually George came down with his mother, and she was suffering from various things. And so that was one of the reasons they came down here. She was down here treated by a physician, and he was off on horseback falling in love with this place we live in.
That's one thing that I love. You mentioned the breathing porches, and here's our money for the breathing porch. Edwin Grove made his fortune on chill tonics.
And Grove Park Inn is a big part of this.
Sure, absolutely.
Big part of this book too. Yeah.
And what always fascinates me about this moment in the late 19th century is the confidence man, the swindler, whether that's political or cultural, and just the ways that people were living and taking in information and making decisions. It's just fascinating. So, you mentioned the Queen of Versailles. Can you talk a little bit about George's plan for the Biltmore house, how he kind of wanted to situate it on a particular piece of land, a particular landscape, and what some of his influences were, from architecture to like the feudal land system that he was borrowing from England and other inspirations?
He was, as a Vanderbilt, and the youngest son of William Henry, he was very lucky that his family had a long relationship with the architect of the Gilded Age, Richard Morris Hunt, and with the father of landscape architecture, Frederick Law Olmsted. And Olmsted had spent writing. He wrote about, he traveled throughout the South and actually wrote a lot about, years earlier, about the landscapes and culture and slavery and a lot of different things. So when George was first initially, interested in, the land and the area, he brought Olmsted down, and Olmsted was not particularly impressed, because so much of the land had been just over-lumbered. It was not in great shape. However, he thought the position was nice, and that was all, there's a wonderful biography of Frederick Law Olmsted called A Clearing in the Distance. I can never pronounce the author's last name. It makes me feel bad, but that's the name of the book, Clearing in the Distance. And you can get all of Olmsted's papers now, all of his letters, all of his plans, all of his instructions. The instructions he would leave to the people who were working on the landscape were just so incredibly detailed. Then he, Richard Morris Hunt, was in a lot of ways almost kind of like a father figure to George. They worked incredibly closely, and they traveled in Europe and in England to look at various, castles and estates, especially in France. They were down in the Loire Valley. They were, chateaus. You can see a lot of the influences of some of these different structures on what was the final result of Biltmore House. And it was not intended to be 175,000 square feet. It was, what do they call it? Project creep. Yeah. That's what you call it. Like, I'm gonna redo, all I need to do is retile my bathroom. Oh, you know what, but as long as I'm doing this, I should really take that faucet out. Well, you know what, I've never liked this wall. I mean, it's like that, but on a much larger scale. So I mean, you could not have asked, and then they bring in Carl Schenk, and then eventually it's Gifford Pinchot. I mean, you could not have asked for a better creative brain trust from not just structurally, but position, forestry, landscape, to just bring all of that together.
And no pressure if some of this stuff's out of your mind after working on this, but
yeah, I'm 2 books ahead of this. I was just I was reading letters from 1763 like 3 days ago. So I'm like,
I was putting these questions together, and I was like, I wonder if Denise remembers the answer to this. But one thing that I think is so fascinating is the role that the architecture of Biltmore had, and the architects of Biltmore had on the city of Asheville. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about how people, the artisans working there, were doing other projects in town?
Yeah, I can to a certain extent. So they were bringing in people from all over with very specific skills, especially since, they were trucking in, bringing in by rail car, because they had a spur actually built from what was then the town of Best, what is now Biltmore Village. They had a spur built just so they could just train stuff right onto the construction site, and Indiana limestone and all this incredible material. Well, they needed masons, like people who were trained to work with that kind of material. And so people were coming in from all over to work on the house. A lot of them were living in the cottages and things that we see now in Biltmore Village. And Richard Moore's Hunt, we talk about the house itself. The cathedral, the All Souls, that's Richard Moore's Hunt, is the only existing Richard Moore's Hunt church left anywhere. And All Souls has a tremendous history for that reason. So all of these folks who were living here, they were working on this house for a while. They started doing their own projects, and then you get into the legacy of what I would consider to be like an architectural craftsman boom in Asheville. People like Richard Sharp Smith, and all of these folks, and you can see the impact throughout the city, as long as it doesn't get knocked down, so we can have another multi-use thing being built somewhere. But that's a story for another time.
So one thing I know that you like talking about is gossip.
Oh,
and
yes.
I don't like to gossip, so listen clearly the first time.
Okay.
The gossip pages,
oh my God.
Turn of the century, were alive and well, late 19th, early 20th century. Can you tell us about how George's work on Biltmore and his marriage to Edith how those things were covered in the gossip pages?
It is hard to imagine. We have the 24-hour news cycle now, and we have things like TMZ, and we have, Entertainment Tonight, and we have all that sort of stuff. Well, they had 4 different editions sometimes every day for a newspaper. Gossip columnists were the TMZ of the day, essentially, and they sometimes went by, aliases like, Charlie Knickerbocker. Charlie Knickerbocker says. Charlie Knickerbocker saw, Mrs. Vanderbilt at the opera, and she was showing her shoulders. It was all of this sort of stuff. They would talk. They talk about people's clothes. They talked about who they were sitting with and whether or not they were supposed to be sitting with that person. There was a really huge article that when people actually spied a massive model coming out of Hunt's offices, and it was an early model of Biltmore, and that gets written up in the newspaper. And then, George was considered one of the most, eligible bachelors in the country, if not the world, one of the wealthiest families on the planet, and he was unmarried. And, so people were always trying to, guess who he was going to end up with. It is no wonder he wanted to leave New York and go to Southern Appalachia. I mean, there's a part of me that thinks that he, kind of wanted to get away from all that and kind of get some breathing porch room.
Nice tie-in. Can you tell us a little bit about the folks who were in their orbit and people who visited the Biltmore and maybe some of their thoughts about it? I'm thinking about Henry James and his take on Biltmore and how miserable he found it, and other people.
It's funny because you don't know how people are gonna react. Henry James, thought it was very drafty and very cold and very damp, and Edith Wharton loved it. She loved the views, and this is somebody who grew up in New York. She loved what she saw. So it was Paul Lester Ford was a visitor. Paul Lester Ford loved it. He and George used to stay up and play chess in the library. I love that library. I mean, obviously, it was probably one of my favorite rooms in the house. And so it's always interesting because you're like, this is the grandest, place in the country, but it wasn't like Newport, where you had all the cottages and all the families, were there. The Astors were there. The other branches, his brothers, other Vanderbilts had houses there, and you were close to Newport itself was a very fashionable city. Asheville was not completely unfashionable, but it certainly wasn't Newport, and it certainly wasn't New York. I think that was part of the appeal for those who liked it, just the long sweeping views and be able to walk and walk and walk and walk and not run into somebody you already knew and would have seen if you had stayed in New York City.
Sure. Yeah.
It's like the Hamptons today. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I've never been there, but I imagine so. But I want to ask about, you mentioned, is it Millionaires Row in Rhode Island?
No, in New York City.
In New York City. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the Gilded Age? You mentioned Astor. I'm thinking about Astor's Ballroom and then the number of people who could fit. Wasn't it the 400?
The 400.
The 400, which was the amount of people who could fit in Lady Astor's Ballroom, and that was the upper echelon of society. But the Vanderbilts, for all of their wealth, were considered kind of relatively new money.
Oh yeah.
And do you think that there was, in building these huge homes like the Breaks and the Biltmore House, was there some reaching for something?
It's hard to, it's kind of hard to say. I mean, the new money, absolutely no question. I mean, George's grandfather, the Commodore, grew up on a farm with next to nothing, working every day, and basically started with a little piragua, they called it, a very simple boat, rowing across Staten Island, and then he develops a shipping and rail empire. I mean, unbelievable. His son, William Henry, more than doubles what was already an unfathomable, just you could not imagine the amount of money, especially at a time when they weren't paying taxes, And then, so George grew up very wealthy, not having to worry about anything, but that still was, that was new. Yeah. And the Vanderbilts started building, further north. I mean, like the upper 20s and 30s in New York City, like that was uptown. I mean, up near where George's father, William Henry, built what was called the Triple Palace. I mean, I think that had been it was somebody's goat farm or something. I mean, they were pushing up into parts of New York that people didn't think would ever, be populated. And then when his brother, built a place on 57th, corner of 57th Street, which is the biggest place, private residence that was ever built in New York City. I mean, that was the hinterlands, But it's like, when I was living there and going to NYU and working in the Village, it's, people were like, Williamsburg, Brooklyn. Now Brooklyn is, everybody wants to go to Brooklyn. Back then it was, how do you get out there, so.
How do you think their relatively new station not only affected the perception of the family in these circles, but how do you think it might have played a role in their economic futures, the instability of their economic futures?
That's a very interesting question. So going back to the 400, so there was another very popular gossip columnist, Ward McAllister. He was a society writer. He was very close with the Mrs. Astor, and reportedly once printed a list of the 400. And I mean, if you weren't on the list, then you might as well not exist, and you weren't going to get invited to the parties, and no one was going to show up at your parties, and all of that sort of middle school stuff. And, you know, I think that a lot of factors came into play. You know, at the turn of the century, you really do start seeing things change for a lot of these families, not just in America, but in England as well. The upkeep for these houses was tremendous. You know, they say shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 2 generations. You know, like the first generation works to earn the money, the next generation has the money, and then the next generation needs to learn how to work again because none of them have, you know, known how to kind of hold on to it. And that wasn't always necessarily the case across all of these families, but things like the advent of taxes really changed things for everyone. And, you know, just sort of a changing climate as well. The Guild came off the Gilded Age, but, you know, and Mark Twain is actually credited, he and a neighbor of his, when they wrote the book called The Gilded Age, they were skewering this particular, you know, tier of society. And if you think about it, like when you gild something, you take a really tiny little bit of gold and you make crappier metal look better, you know? Yeah. And so Twain was really, when he was writing about the Gilded Age, really had some, it was almost like he was saying, well, at some point that's going to scrape off, and, you know, things are going to go back to very different reality.
So I want to talk about the forestry program and Carl Schenck, and also talking about the gold being scraped off. Wasn't Carl Schenck one of the first at Biltmore to kind of see what was kind of coming down the pike in terms of George's finances?
Well, he was one of the people I found evidence of. That who knew what when is very difficult to pinpoint. And if I can't like nail something down 100%, I'm not going to say it's one way or the other. But Carl Schenck, who was the first forestry person to come in and try and rehab the land, did have, you know, see hints like Edith crying, a letter he opened he wasn't supposed to open regarding to loaning people money, things of that nature. But one of the reasons I really liked working on this was people don't realize the very first forestry school ever in the United States of America was the Biltmore Forestry School. The very first, before Yale, before it started here. And you think about the legacy of that, not only in the United States, because people started modeling what they were doing. I mean, Schenck took those guys, they lived out in the forest. And if you've never done the tours that you can do in Pisgah Forest about where Schenck was and the cabins and stuff, it's very cool. And there's actually a really good restaurant now called Forestry Camp, which is one of the old buildings, I think, where some of the forestry students used to live. They have very good food. But to me, in many ways, you know, Edith really went out of her way to make sure, you know, at the height of their holdings, it was like 125,000 acres, something like that, bigger than Washington, D.C. And, you know, roughly 90,000 or so acres of that became the basis of Pisgah National Forest. And if they had not made the efforts to A, rehab that land, maintain it, bring in forestry people to make sure that it would have long-term sustainability and success, and then not sell it off to loggers, we would be living at a place that looked very, very different. So I think it's kind of interesting that when you're talking about the legacy of the Vanderbilts in Western North Carolina, I don't think it's what they built, I think it's what they didn't build is the greatest part of what they contributed to this community. And I think that's you know, hiking and fishing and kayaking and walking and preserving and appreciating the forests and the waterfalls and all that. That's a huge part of what it means to live in this part of the country, and we have them to thank for it.
That's why many of us are here.
Yeah, and that's them.
Can we talk about Edith? After George's untimely passing, Edith steps in and protects his legacy. She shores up the financial situation of Biltmore. She takes care of the land, really makes major decisions that impact Biltmore's legacy that we understand as being today. Can you talk about her role and just her as an individual and kind of as a visionary?
Well, she was going back to, your first question, when did you, what kind of brought this together? I mean, one of the key reasons I wanted to work on this project was her, because I thought she was just so fascinating. She was orphaned at a young age. She was a direct descendant of Peter Stuyvesant, who was the last Dutch governor of, New York City. So she didn't have necessarily a ton of money, but she had she knew all the right people. Yeah. Her relatives were on. She had the pedigree. For her family, the Fishes, the Stuyvesants, they were all on. They were 400 people. Sure. And she was very tight with her sisters, and probably more so because of having lost their parents and then their grandparents at such a young age. And some of the best finds, in addition to the New York Public Library manuscripts and archives, was at the Hayes Library in, yes, that's the name of the library. Oh, wait, get that wrong. Brown University's research library in Providence, Rhode Island, because one of Edith's sisters married John Brown. And John. See, the names go right out of my head. And they all named their kids the same. Do you ever notice that? They all named their kids the same thing. So their archives were incredible. And he was another one, because the Brown family was incredibly wealthy. So he was another one who was always in the gossip pages. So getting to read Edith's sister, Pauline, wrote a really lovely biography of their childhood and their young adulthood, and it was beautiful to read. And you can really see, Edith was, she kept turtles and she was outside, and you could really get a feeling of who she would become. And then the sisters went and lived in Paris, so you get to see that aspect of the Gilded Age, what it was like over in Paris. And there was so much fun kind of color, and she just seemed like a really enthusiastic, interesting, wonderful person, which is great, because sometimes you start doing research into people and you're like, ooh,
Yeah, I was really surprised or touched by how warmly people at Biltmore welcomed her when they were married.
And not just that, but talking about she and George did a lot of charitable acts in the community. Edith was somebody, if a worker or someone was sick or their wife was pregnant, she'd get a basket of some food and some blankets, and she'd ride out to their house and bring it. This is the mistress of the largest house in America, and she's hopping on a horse to go bring somebody something. The arts and crafts movement, helping establish the school. The YMI, exactly. The Young Men's Institute, which was the heart of Black Asheville history, and that's enjoying a very nice kind of rebirth. They're reworking a lot of those buildings, and all that stuff is, a lot of that all ties back to the Vanderbilts.
Yeah, sure. And Edith especially.
And her desire to be a part of the community, to help the community. The domestic science school she started. It was never about. There was this, during the Gilded Age especially, there was this idea that if you were wealthy, you did charitable acts. It was actually part of your social. It was part of your social activity. You're going to go to a charity fundraiser and this, that, and the other thing. Doing that and writing a check is very different than finding people and starting a school and going out and visiting folks in the community. So there was an authenticity and an intimacy, really, to what she was willing to do in the community, and it was the kind of thing that you wouldn't see really in New York City.
And y'all have to forgive me, I can't remember if it's in this book or if it's in We Gather Together, but the story of the wealthy folks in New York City having the Thanksgiving.
Watching them eat.
Yeah.
They dined, yeah.
Was that in Last Castle?
That's in Last Castle. And it was an example of this kind of this sort of the theater of charity, in a sense. Yeah, it was one huge Thanksgiving. It was Madison Square Garden, and the people who had funded, given the money so that the less fortunates could actually have a Thanksgiving meal, they were sitting up above, like watching the meal take place. And it was I found this, it was a really long article. It was in very old, copy of the New York Times, and it was, I forget the title, but it was a very funny headline, but something like they watched dined or something like that. But yeah, it was there was an element of theater and show to what they were doing, whereas Edith was just down here in southern Appalachia, out there doing it.
Helping people make it.
Very different. Yep.
So I want to encourage y'all in the next little bit, if you have questions for Denise, if you'll take some questions if you're interested. And we've got some books outside for Malaprops. I'm sure Denise is happy to sign books. If she's not, I'm happy to sign her books. George and Edith had a child, Cornelia. And in 1930, Cornelia and Jack Cecil made the decision to open the doors of the Biltmore house to the public. Can you talk about that moment and what that moment meant, not only for the Biltmore house, but for this area as a hub of really global tourism?
It was a rough time because the Depression was essentially, still going on. And I thought it was interesting that, let's take people's mind off the Depression by showing them a really fancy house. there was a part of it that was like, I don't know. It wasn't a continuous, the doors closed again, and then reopened much later and in a much different fashion. And obviously the doors are open now and they're doing quite well. And it is remarkable when you look at how many houses we either knocked down, turned into condos, turned into universities, that the house still exists, still has a lot of the original furniture, art, etc., is still in the family. And that a lot of that was the decision to keep it private as opposed to going the nonprofit route like the Rockefellers and Colonial Williamsburg, something like that.
Yeah.
It definitely had I don't know if the 1930 episode, that was sort of more for the community, but certainly in later years, the idea to open the house, I think they probably had, they were planting, early on, the brothers were like planting their own flowers and like doing their own advertising and all that sort of stuff. I don't think anybody could have imagined it would, see over 1 million visitors a year. Yeah.
Do y'all have any questions for Denise about her process or research or anything about
recipes? Gardening. There's a lot of that going on right now.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
I just have a question. I have been reading your book at the same time I was streaming The Gilded Age on HBO.
Do you like it?
I did. It was interesting seeing the parallels and I just wonder if you saw.
I've only seen, that's a great question. So he's talking about is anybody else watching The Gilded Age on HBO? Do you guys like it? Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. I watched the first two, I think the first 2 episodes, and I enjoyed it. But it's just, I think it's, when you do these books, you spend so much time in a certain time period, you just need a break, you just need a break. And also when you shift to something else, you kind of sort of bury yourself in that time period as well. But I loved the first 2 episodes that I saw. How many, is the first season over already?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Does she get into society? Does it go well for her? Because I remember the one, it was either the first or second episode where no one shows up for her party. That was hard. I felt bad. I felt bad for her. That was a lot of food. Yeah.
Have you read Fortune's Children?
Yeah, Fortune's Children was one of, if you're interested in all the stuff that went into the book, there's a massive section of endnotes here. I did look at Fortune's Children was one of many books. Yeah.
I see a lot of parallels between what you're saying and what was in Fortune's Children.
I think Fortune's Children had a more singular focus.
Yes.
Yeah, whereas Last Castle really,
I don't know Fortune's Children.
it's a little more focused really just on the financial rise and fall of the family, which mine is not really.
It
Yeah.
covers the Astors and the Browns and the...
Oh yeah, well anything you read from that era, all those names are going to be in there.
all of it.
All those names are going to be in
They all
there.
had the big houses in New York.
And the places in Newport. Oh yeah, so I actually was just interviewed up in New York. There's going to be a documentary series called American Dynasties that's going to talk about the Astors and the Vanderbilts and all that. And I was, one of those little talking head people to talk about the Vanderbilts. And I think that airs in, I think that's on Fox in June, maybe, something. Yeah, I don't know. What am I supposed to do? Tweet about it or something? I don't,
You can tweet about it. See if Elon Musk will let you get on there.
Yeah.
Could you share a little bit more about Cornelia and her little arty time, particularly in Europe?
Well, there's some of that. I mean, there is as much as I could find is in the book.
Okay.
I don't want to necessarily spoil too much of it for people who haven't read it yet, but I think I always thought it was so lovely that George and Edith decided to have Cornelia here in Asheville. They still had a place in Washington, D.C. They still had family in New York. They still had a place in New York. They obviously had family in Newport. And, in a lot of ways, she was kind of a child of two worlds. I mean, she grew up essentially on a farm, a giant estate that, horses and mountains and streams and waterfalls. She went to school with the village. She went to school. She didn't go to some private fancy school or get sent off to boarding school. When she was here, she went to school in the village with the workers' kids, But she, when she decided to, kind of go her own way, and she was in New York, but she was very much an Asheville girl. She dyed her hair, she was an Asheville girl. She dyed her hair. She got into the arts. She would fit right in today. She'd be perfect. And then, she ended up going over to England, and she started a foundation and started to divest herself of all of her money. That foundation still exists, and it supports differently abled individuals and the unhoused, and it still exists. Yeah.
She's a fascinating character.
So that whole,
Commodore to George to Cornelius.
Yeah, that whole charitable streak in that family, and it's anonymous. Like it's very hard to get her name connected to that foundation, but I didn't. But I did want to because I thought it was so lovely what she did.
I've always been curious about the collection. George was a bibliophile, and I was wondering, has anybody written anything, and maybe it's in your book and I haven't got to,
about his books?
About the collection, and then sort of an analysis. I read maybe 20 years ago that Biltmore had hired a librarian for the first time, and they were actually cataloging those books, and they found a first edition Moby Dick.
Yeah, no, there are some, there are a couple library scenes in there, and I do mention some of the gems that are in that collection. And when he was younger, he used to keep very detailed diaries about all the books that he read, which I thought he was incredibly studious. So I would love to see them do just a giant catalog that listed every book that was in there. I would love to see that.
I'd always had the idea that the Cecil family was sure lucky that they married into the Vanderbilt family, but in reading your book, my sense is that we are lucky to have had the Cecil family, or we might not have what we have today.
It's, certainly the products the offspring of the Cecils and the Vanderbilts for sure. When Cornelia married into the Cecil family, there was a lot of, speculation that he needed that marriage. But then their children, I mean, they are responsible, but the Cecil Vanderbilts, they are responsible for what we have here. The ins and outs and specifics of what was going on, financially between Cornelia and her husband, I think they both kind of helped each other out in different ways. But the sons, you're right, we wouldn't have what we have here had they not kind of dug in and turned things around for sure.
But Cornelia just disappeared, essentially, didn't she?
She moved. You breathed it. Not everybody's read the book. You're writing it for everybody. Spoiler alert. She did leave. Yes, she did.
I thought it was interesting in the book because today we see it as such a cash cow, for lack of a better word. I mean, it's so financially successful. But for so many years, not only with the forestry stuff, but with the dairy, and the stats on when they finally turned a profit. I thought that was fascinating.
It took a long time for them to turn a profit, and there's towards the end of the book, I talk about they were at one point approaching Natalie's husband up at Brown, like, did he know, not a curator, who's somebody who comes in and assesses your art's worth. I'm having a blank. What?
Appraiser.
Thank you. An appraiser. Did they know of an appraiser who would be good to appraise the value of the rugs and everything else that was in there? And joking in correspondence with that woman, well, you can come, we have sandwiches, but we don't have much else. I mean, it was definitely not roll out the lobsters and come appraise our art. So you can see little bits of evidence of the struggle that was taking place, especially, around the, around the middle, maybe a little bit pre-World War II, right around then. So yeah, I mean, that's one of the interesting things about it. You can actually see like, oh, this almost didn't make it, and what a different place this would be if it hadn't,
Yes, ma'am.
How has the Biltmore House reacted to your book? And did I hear somebody say they won't sell it there?
I don't know, I have never asked if it's sold there, so I can't.
Somebody said it's not.
Okay.
I did, because, the book club that I'm in, she told us that, the gal that chose your book to read, and
Okay.
she said it wasn't sold there, and we thought that was very strange, we wondered why.
I don't know.
Well, I think,
honestly, I don't have anything to do with where my books are sold. But there are Barnes and Noble and Amazon, and it's published in Chinese. I mean, it's a very popular book. I'm okay.
Has the house, the company, have they, given you good accolades for that, or?
I don't talk to anybody there, really. I mean, it's very important for me as, throughout doing the book, I have to do this independently.
Sure.
I can't partner with an interested party when I'm writing history. So I've never really had, extensive connections. I don't know the family, so, yeah. I don't know, I heard through one person who knew somebody who said, oh, so-and-so really liked it, but, that's all. I've never had a conversation with anyone at the house about the book.
Yeah. And Denise's background's in journalism, so that
I take that very seriously.
that line between subject and work is pretty stark,
Absolutely.
drawn, yeah.
It has to be.
Sure.
Yeah.
Whereas I write novels, I just get to make it whatever.
He
I
just
want.
makes stuff up.
I'm like, is this based on so and so? I'm like, maybe.
Maybe. Do you want it to be?
Yeah, exactly.
It could be. Do you want to be in the book?
Anyone else? Yes.
I want to say thank you, but also I took an Ollie class on Southern Appalachian authors and read your work.
Oh my God.
We need to hear you, about you at one of these.
Oh, well, thank you.
Absolutely.
I'm sure you read my book, Cold Mountain. best-selling novel. Somebody asked me earlier tonight if I read Cold Mountain, and I told Colleen, I was like, would I be here if I wrote Cold Mountain? Would I have ever written another book if I'd written Cold Mountain? I don't know why he did, you know. Should I have retired? I'd have been. Anyway.
Kids wouldn't have been eating bologna.
That's exactly right.
Live in the pool.
That's exactly right. Can I get some cheese in my bologna, Dad? You wrote Cold Mountain. You can, honey.
I agree with, thank you very much, and I agree with you 100%. Wiley's a tremendous, I mean, you know, I know lots of things about Wiley, but he's a tremendous asset in this community and a tremendous asset for this university. And Asheville has such we're a very small part of Asheville's literary history, so it's delightful to just be any part of it. And Wiley's making sure that people know about that and making it accessible. So yeah, you.
Well, thank you, Denise, and thank you all for coming tonight and for being part of this this academic year. I hope we keep it going next year in the fall with Jason Mott's book, Hell of a Book. We'll have programming around violence, all kinds of things, but then we'll also have programming around how do books get marketed? How do you send an author out on book tour? So we'll take it from the very heavy to the very light, from the very serious to the very funny. And Jason will be here with us as part of the Asheville Ideas Fest, June 14th through 18th, his event, 9:30 in the morning on June 15th with Charles Frazier. So please come see Jason and I speak about Cold Mountain. It'll be a great time. But thank you all so much for coming and have a great night.
Thank
Denise will be
you.
out front. Books are for sale, so please pick one up.